Okay, so before we start our theoretical discussion, because we all know what we're going to decide, that we do eat turkey. It is considered a kosher bird. But as way of introduction, there's possibly a mitzvah say in eating turkey after we learn these halachas, even if you don't believe there's any reason to eat turkey for Thanksgiving per se. Because the Rambam, in the beginning of Hilchos Machalos Asuros, brings that there is a mitzvah asay leida hasimanim shemavdilan bein behema v'chayev of v'dag v'chagav shemotel achlan v'bein she'ena motel achlan. There is a positive commandment to know the signs that differentiate between a animal, domesticated or wild animal, a bird, a fish, or a grasshopper that are permitted to eat and that are not permitted to eat. So we're going to discuss the signs of permitted birds through in the course of this discussion, and the way the way Chaim Kanievsky understands the Rambam in his kuntras on Karnei Chagam. He has a piece on the signs of grasshoppers. So the first chapter he discusses whether there is a mitzvah say for him to learn these halachas. So what he comes out with is that someone who is going to eat an animal would have a positive commandment to check and make sure that it's a kosher animal, and therefore if they're going to go eat turkey, it would be a positive commandment according to the Rambam to learn what the signs are that would make it a kosher bird. Okay.
Are the birds distinguished by signs in the same way that animals or fish are?
No. The main difference is the signs of animals and fish are in the Chumash. The signs of kosher birds are not in the Chumash.
So someone's generalizing from the example.
From the list, yes. Okay. The beginning of our discussion, and really the reason why it is a discussion, is when the Shulchan Aruch brings the halachas of which birds are permitted. So Shulchan Aruch brings it in Siman Pei Beis in Yeridea 82. The siman begins that the signs of kosher birds are not explicitly explained in the Torah. The Torah just lists the non-kosher birds as a way of saying,
by process of elimination.
Right, by process of elimination, the Torah lists the non-kosher birds, which implies any birds that don't make the list are kosher. So that would seem to be very straightforward. The Torah lists what we're going to call 24 birds. How it gets to 24 is a little bit complicated, but that's not the point of this discussion. So the second halacha in Shulchan Aruch is anyone who's an expert in those 24 things, in their species and their names, so he can eat any bird that's not one of those 24 and doesn't need to check for anything. And if you have a bird that you have a tradition is kosher, meaning it's something that's obvious to everybody that this bird is permitted, it's mutter. And if you have, skipping a little bit, well, let's go in order. Then the Rambam, then the Shulchan Aruch brings, if you don't recognize the bird, and if you don't recognize the 24 birds in the Chumash, which presumably at this point nobody does, because already in the Gemara they're unsure about the identification of some of them. So then there's simanim, there's signs which you can use to check. We'll come back to them. I'm just going to mention them in passing. Any bird that is dores, that attacks and eats, that's not that's one of the non-kosher birds. If it's not a predatory bird, then if it has an extra finger and a crop, a zephic, as a storage pouch in the esophagus of some birds where they can store food before it goes to the stomach, and if it's gizzard, if its stomach lining can be peeled off by hand, those three things are a sign that it's a kosher bird. Fine. Then the Shulchan Aruch says at the end of the list, even if it has all three simanim, Still, we're concerned. So it has all the signs of a kosher bird. We're concerned that perhaps, even though you didn't see it attack anything else, perhaps it is a predatory bird, and therefore we don't eat any birds unless we have a tradition given to us from our forefathers that they're kosher. So that's the final word in the Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam says nothing on it. So it would seem to be the clear halachic consensus would be that in order to eat a bird, you would either have to know what all the 24 birds are, which is something we don't, or you'd have to have a tradition. The problem is having a tradition on turkeys, which come from the New World, would be a little bit difficult to arrange because nobody knew about turkeys in the 1200s, so that would create a automatic break in your train of tradition. So we'd like to try to explain how turkeys made it in. So
how is it unlike a big chicken?
Turkeys are different. Well, so there is a discussion. Much of the discussion is about geese. Apparently, there are a few primary species of geese that they ate, and other subspecies of geese were greatly debated whether they are the same, they're not the same. But it seems the consensus seems that if something is of a significantly different size and appearance, which turkeys are, then you can't just assume it's part of the same thing. There are discussions whether things like the chicken having feathers on its legs is enough to make it a different species, or different things like that. The general consensus is that we would be concerned that there are different species. So at least there's... Okay. So let's start at the beginning. The Mishnah in Chulin is the basis for this discussion about the kosher signs of birds. So the Mishnah says the signs of the birds there are not said in the Chumash. Right? The Chumash just lists the non-kosher birds, but the Chachamim have a rule. Any bird that's what the Mishnah uses the term dores, which I translated before as a predator. The definition of dores is rather unclear. There are many different opinions in the Rishonim as to how to translate it. Rashi says two different things in two different places. On the Mishnah, Rashi says dores means that it picks up, it uses its claws to pick up food and hold it while it eats it. Rashi later in the Gemara says that it uses its claws to hold down food on the ground while it tears off with its beak. Other possible explanations are that it attacks and eats things while they're still alive. It doesn't just eat dead things. The people who give this opinion speak out that obviously eating insects is not going to count as eating living creatures, because even chickens and all the more obviously kosher birds do that. Another possibility is that it uses its claws to attack prey. So you have different... exactly what the piece is that the bird has to do is not so clear what makes it a dores, but the commonality of all of them is it's using its claws in some form or fashion in getting prey and eating it. So any bird that's predatory is not a kosher bird, and you can't eat it. And then it lists kol sheyesh li etzba yasera, a bird that has an extra finger. Or it's already debatable. There's a dispute of how you translate etzba yasera. Is it an extra finger or a longer finger? So does it mean that a bird that has a toe in the back of its leg, right, like a chicken does? A chicken has three fingers and three toes in the front and one in the back. So that toe in the back would be called the etzba yasera, or do you translate it etzba yasera as a longer finger? So if it has talking about the three toes, that the middle toe extends further than the two on either side. Vizefik, it has a crop that's straightforward. The korkavona niklaf, and its stomach, its gizzard can be peeled. That's tar. Those are the signs of a tar bird. So we have one sign of a non-kosher bird is that it's a predatory. Three signs of kosher birds that they have this extra finger, a crop, and a stomach that's more easily peeled. And then Rebbe Tzaddik adds another statement: at any bird that splits its toes is tummy. Meaning, if it has an even number of toes, if when it perches on something it puts 2 on one side and 2 on the other, then you know that that bird is dores, that it uses its claws to grab things presumably, and that would be tummy. Okay, so how did we arrive at this list of simanim if all we started with was a list of non-kosher birds? So the Gemara says really what they looked at is the list of non-kosher birds begins with a nesher, which is commonly translated as an eagle, or possibly a vulture, some large bird that's carnivorous. And that bird has none of these signs. So that's part of the discussion in determining the nesher. Is really, it comes down to the etzbi yisera. If etzbi yisera means a toe in the back, well, eagles have claws in the back, so that wouldn't fit well. If it means a longer finger, they only have two, so they can't have a longer one in front. Okay, but whatever the nesher is, the Gemara says that nesher for sure has none of these signs, and the most kosher bird, the turtle doves and pigeons, which are the birds that are the only ones that can be brought as karbonos, have none of these signs. So, and then the rest of the birds in the list of the 23 have some of the signs, but not all of them. And then it becomes a somewhat complicated machlokas, but this is what everything is going to hinge on, and how you define the rest of the signs. So the Gemara says if you have a bird that has only one kosher sign, you can assume it's kosher. Because in the list of non-kosher birds, there's the nesher, which has no kosher signs, the paris and the aznia, which only have one, and the remaining 20, the oirev, which has 2, and the remaining 20, which have 3. So Rashi understands it to mean, just a simple way to read it. It reads much more simply, that nesher is a bird that has none of these signs. I mean, it's a predatory. It doesn't have its extra toe. It doesn't have a crop, and you can't peel its stomach lining. Then paris and aznia, which it's clear in the Gemara, each have only one kosher sign. But the Gemara says we know that these birds are not birds that live in inhabited areas. So if you find a bird in an inhabited area, which is presumably where you are, you can assume it's not one of them, because they live out in, sounds like either deserts or islands, or something you're unlikely to run into. There is the
species from other continents where the Jews never went.
It's possible, but Moshe, the Medrash does say that that Moshe did show the Jewish people what the kosher animals and non-kosher birds look like. Okay. It's possible that one was brought to him for that purpose. It's possible that, sorry, so the Ran does speak out that perhaps paris and aznia were only uncommon in the area in Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, in the areas where the Jews were at the time, but maybe they were more common where we are in Southern Europe, or wherever in America. So perhaps here we would be concerned that a random bird we find is a paris or an aznia. Then the Gemara says the oirev, which is traditionally it's translated as the raven, it's clearly a black bird, because the term it's shachar k'ayr is used to refer to a raven. However, already the complication becomes specifically by raven, because 4 times in the Chumash when it lists a non-kosher bird, it says limineu, to its kind. And the Medrash understands that to mean that it's not a single species, it's a family of species, and all the subspecies are going to be included. So this is going to, so even if you know the 24 birds in the Chumash, you're still going to be in trouble, because orev, the Medrash lists 4 subspecies of orev. I think zarzer, Rashi Yevanim with some Greek head. There's savlana and one more. But again, so the pool of birds you're going to have to know becomes bigger, the Gemara says that Aya and Raya and Daya are all the same bird. That of those, there are 100 species across the world. So again, you have to know a pretty long list of non-kosher birds in order to determine that this one is not a non-kosher bird. So process of elimination becomes difficult to find. So, and then continuing the list, Rashi says so 20 Oirev has two of the kosher signs, and the rest of the birds have 3 kosher signs. And based on this, Rashi says, so that means if you find a bird that had, the Gemara brings a statement that at one point they determined that there were 2 similar species of bird. One was called a Tarnagol d'Agma, one was kind of called a Tarnagolta d'Agma. They called one what would translate as a swamp hen, and the other a swamp rooster. And they thought that the one they called the swamp hen was kosher, the one they called the swamp rooster was not. And then they observed it being dores, and they said, oh, we must have been mistaken. So Rashi says, based on that, any bird you see, you're going to have a problem. Because even if it has all 3 kosher signs, 20 of the non-kosher birds have all 3 kosher signs. And you need all 4 to be confident. And you see from the Gemara already that they messed up in this assessment of whether it's dores or not. So therefore, Rashi says you should not eat any bird without a tradition that it's a kosher bird, because you can never be sure that it's not a dores. And really, Rashi is the opinion that's codified in the Shulchan Aruch, which is why the Shulchan Aruch says we need a tradition in order to eat a bird, because even if it has all 3 kosher signs, Rashi said we should be afraid that maybe, even though we haven't observed it attacking anything, maybe it does at times. Okay. The other Rishonim point out that as much as Rashi reads the best in the Gemara, there are some practical problems with it. For example, a Oirev is supposed to have only 2 non-kosher signs according to Rashi's read, and it doesn't really work, because we know that an Orev. We know that a Orev is a predatory bird. So that's one strike against it. And it does not have a crop. Oh, sorry, maybe I'm forgetting what it is, but it doesn't fit. They also ask similarly, an ostrich is one of the non-kosher birds, and an ostrich does not seem to have 3 non-kosher signs. A hawk is also one of the birds that would assume to be non-kosher, and it doesn't have 3 signs. So they ask that it doesn't fit with the list. So they give an alternate read of the Gemara, which is that the statements in the Mishnah are really 2 independent statements. Any bird that's dores is not kosher. Any birds that have the 3 simanim are kosher. So there is no bird that has all 3 of these signs that is non-kosher. There's no bird that would attack other birds that is kosher. And then the Orev has. So they read the list the other way, that the 20 birds have each have 1 non-kosher sign. The Orev, they are predatory, and in addition to that, they have 1 non-kosher sign. The Orev is predatory and has 2 non-kosher signs, and the Paris and Aznia are unique in that one of them has the kosher sign that it's not a dores, it doesn't attack other birds, but it still is non-kosher, and the other is not dores, and the other is just a predatory bird. It is one's not a predatory. One's sign is it's not predatory, and the other has one of the signs like all the other 20. So it's really 21.
Predatory means eating animals.
Meaning, right, eating animals. Yeah. So according to this opinion, if you had a bird that has all 3 kosher signs, you know for sure it's not predatory, and then you'd be able to eat it, and you wouldn't have Rashi's concern that maybe it will be predatory, because the Mishnah is telling you that there are no there are no predatory birds that have all three signs. Just on a side point, Tosfos wonders that the Mishnah says any bird that splits its toes, is a predatory bird, and which implies if not. Oh, sorry. No, first thing, how do we know this statement that all birds that are all the birds that are kosher are not predatory? There's no tradition for it. No one claims it's an oral tradition from Sinai. The Mishnah just seems to state it as a fact, which would imply that someone experimented with all the birds and discovered this to be true, which would be difficult because who had access to all the birds? So Tosfos suggests that perhaps Noach is the source of this tradition, since he had all the birds in the teva, and he was able to observe them. Perhaps he made this. He's the source of this distinction that the non-kosher birds are the ones that are the only ones that are dores, and all of the kosher birds are not. Okay. So, really, the breakdown of the sugya comes out that the majority of the Rishonim learn not like Rashi, that with three kosher signs one can assume a bird is kosher and eat it. However, the Beis Yosef brings Rashi and is concerned with Rashi's opinion, and therefore his conclusion is like we started with, that one should not eat a bird unless they have a tradition on it. So that leads us back to the question we started with. So what's with the turkey? There's no tradition going back because there were no turkeys around in Europe for before the early 1500s at the latest. So how do we have a tradition on that? So there's a interesting piece from the Netziv. His discussion over there is there's a certain species of goose, and it has a longer neck and it's bigger than the other geese. And there's discussion: is it the same type? Is it not the same type? And he says at the end, really, if you had asked me this question before people started eating this bird, I would have told them that they shouldn't eat it. But now that it's accepted that people eat it, so unless I can prove it's prohibited, I'm going to allow it, because I wouldn't want to say that the people before me that the previous generation is doing something wrong. So this same idea is part of the motivation in the discussion about turkey, since it became accepted as something that in all segments of the Jewish world, people eat turkey, that no one had any problem with it. So that created more of a push for people to find ways out. So some people went so far as to say, well, you see that the custom is not like the Shulchan Aruch. The custom is to eat turkey. So you see that we don't go with Rashi, even though the Shulchan Aruch does. We're not concerned with it. Another possibility is that the Rugas Habaisim says, as much as Rashi says you shouldn't eat a bird if you don't have, because you should be concerned that it's a dores, but that's only a chumrah. It's a stringency. It's not something that's the letter of the law. So again, if you have people are eating it, and it doesn't seem that we haven't seen it attack any other birds. It seems to be pretty much the same as a chicken, the way it behaves. So we can assume it's not a dores.
When did turkey show up in Europe?
I did a quick Google search. The turkeys showed up in England in 1520s, which will be significant to our next answer.
So were there shiurs going back that far?
No. The shilas about turkeys start much later. It seems that most of the people in Europe thought turkeys came from Turkey, and didn't realize they came. They didn't realize yet that America was a separate continent. They still thought it was in the West.
Did it really matter where they came from?
It didn't really matter where it came from, but somehow when they came to Europe, people assumed that they were kosher already and had some tradition on them. There's speculation as to what other bird they might have mistaken them with to get the tradition, maybe, or maybe we have some other possibilities.
So does the tradition have to go back a certain amount of time, or what?
So that's our next. We'll skip ahead to deal with your discussion. Okay. Another possibility is perhaps the tradition they began eating turkey, like we said, right, Columbus discovered America in 1492. By the early to mid 1500s, turkey was clearly common in Europe. The Shulchan Aruch wasn't published till 1565. So perhaps before the Shulchan Aruch was published, and definitely before it spread as the definitive halachic work, people had begun eating turkey. And as much as we're going to accept the stringency of the Shulchan Aruch, and if you would attempt to introduce turkey now, we would require a tradition which you wouldn't have. But since at the time the Shulchan Aruch had not been accepted as authoritative yet.
How old was the Beis Yosef?
How old was he when he
the
published?
The Beis Yosef, his previous big book.
The Beis Yosef is published shortly before, but it still could make it in. I mean,
okay.
Even you need some time. I don't know how long it took between when he published and when he became widely accepted. Also, so perhaps within that window of time between the early 1500s and the mid to late 1500s, turkey had been accepted because the consensus of whoever it was in whatever communities it was that it first was introduced was that we should go not like Rashi, and we should rely on the fact that it has three of the kosher signs. And then once it's in, so then like you were saying, that maybe we have a tradition now going back to people that permitted it, because the halachic consensus at the time was that you could rely on the kosher signs.
So even if they permitted it by a different criterion than the one you're now using, that's okay, because it happened a long time ago.
It happened, and that was the accepted halacha at the time, right? Another possibility is that perhaps turkeys, even Rashi would agree, we wouldn't have to be concerned they're dores, because Rashi is talking about a wild bird. So you have some wild bird, you observe it for some amount of time, but you don't really have much observation, as opposed to turkey, which is a domesticated bird. So you have lots of people raising lots of turkeys, spending a lot of time around them, and it's been a long time, and no one's observed that they are predatory. So that at a certain point, well, most turkeys in their lifetime don't attack anything. So the concern that maybe this is a predatory bird.
Well, Ben Franklin wanted to make it.
Ben Franklin did want to make it the national bird of this country. I don't know why.
One of his criteria might have been it wasn't a predator.
No, it could be. It's also more useful than the eagle because people eat it.
What about an owl?
An owl
Is it kosher?
Owls are presumably not kosher because the kaha and something else, I think the Gemara says, are birds that have cheeks and faces like humans, which are assumed to mean an owl face, which is more of a flat human type of face than as opposed to a bird with more of a protruding beak type of face. But owls are generally predatory, and they eat mice and rodents usually. Okay. Any questions?